72 years old. That's when most people expect stillness, rest, maybe a garden and a chair by the window. Margaret Hale got divorce papers instead. 47 years of marriage, and Daniel Hale carved it all up like a man portioning meat. The house went to him, the car, the bank accounts. He pushed her out the door with 2 suitcases and didn't bother turning around. Walked away convinced he'd taken everything worth having. But Daniel missed something. One small piece of land tied to Margaret's blood, to her mother's name, to a history he never cared enough to learn. That overlooked detail would eventually make every calculated move he'd made completely meaningless. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, stay with me through to the end. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. October crept down the quiet street like a long, tired breath. Dry leaves scraped across the pavement, gathering near the front steps of the old house. Margaret stood in the doorway, her thin cardigan bunched between her fingers. Not because of the weather. She'd grown used to cold, the kind that lives inside you. No, this was something else, a hollowness spreading behind her ribs, heavy, expanding, as though something had ended years ago and her mind was only now catching up. Behind her, the door groaned open. Movers passed through in steady rotation, hauling out pieces of her life. Lamps, boxes, framed things she couldn't see clearly anymore. They loaded the truck with the blank efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times. No hesitation, no glances exchanged. These were people trained in the quiet demolition of someone else's world. Looking back served no purpose in their line of work. At the bottom of the driveway, Daniel Hale waited beside his polished sedan. The finish caught the pale afternoon light, immaculate against the tired backdrop of the street. He checked his watch, adjusted a cuff. He carried himself like a man running 10 minutes behind for a lunch reservation, not like someone watching the final scene of a marriage that had spanned nearly 5 decades. __quote _0__1 of the movers said, brushing his palms against his thighs. Daniel gave a short nod and pulled a folder from beneath his arm. That folder. Margaret had seen it every day for 3 months. Signatures stacked on signatures, seals pressed into paper, page after careful page. It had dismantled the life she once believed belonged to her. She stepped down one stair. Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, almost swallowed by the wind. He exhaled, not from exhaustion, not from grief, from impatience. He cut her off before she could finish, flat, mechanical. Her eyes drifted past his shoulder, through the open door, a pale rectangle on the wall where their wedding photo had hung for decades. The porch railing, built by his hands the summer their son arrived. It all hit at once. Laughter, birthday candles, whispered conversations past midnight, the silence of early mornings when the house still felt like theirs. The flood of it made her dizzy. But Daniel had already turned his back. He nodded towards the 2 suitcases sitting by the curb, small, ordinary. It seemed impossible that a whole life could fit inside them. He read Margaret's throat tightened around the words. That's what the court assigned to you, he said. His eyes never found hers. Everything else is in my name. Margaret held his gaze a moment longer, searching, scanning for any flicker of doubt, any ghost of the man who once shared her bed for nearly half a century. Nothing. Just a terrible calm. The way you'd look at someone whose name you've already forgotten. 48 years, she whispered. Daniel said nothing. He adjusted his cuff, as if that mattered more. You'll manage, he said at last. There are suitable arrangements for you. Places. Facilities. That word, facilities, hit harder than anything else that left his mouth. Margaret didn't move. Her hands shook, faintly, but she made no effort to hide them. Didn't ball them into fists, just let them hang there, as though they'd stopped belonging to her. His voice didn't shift, not even slightly. That's not your decision anymore. Wind cut between them, kicking dry leaves against the two suitcases. Silence pressed down. Heavy, long. Then Daniel pulled out an envelope, held it toward her. "There's money inside," he said. "Enough to start over." Margaret stared at his hand for what felt like an entire season before she took it. Her fingers were numb against the paper. "Start where?" He paused, the smallest hesitation, barely there. "That's up to you." He turned, opened the car door. The engine hummed to life, smooth and quiet, obscenely quiet. Margaret stood like stone. Some part of her still waited. A different word, a different gesture, anything. Nothing came. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said. The way you'd end a phone call with your insurance agent. The door shut, the car pulled away. He didn't look back, not once. The road emptied, the engine's hum thinned to nothing. What remained was a silence so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin. Margaret kept standing there, eyes locked on the bare stretch of asphalt, as though staring hard enough could undo everything. But nothing undid itself. Finally, her legs gave. She lowered herself onto the curb's edge. Cold concrete bit through the thin fabric of her clothes. She looked down at the cracks in the pavement beneath her shoes, trying to find something solid, something real. Her hand drifted into her handbag, reaching past the sterile paperwork, past the lawyer-stamped documents, searching for something that still felt like hers. Her fingers found it. Small, cool, familiar. She pulled it free, a brass key, old and worn smooth by decades of handling. Margaret turned it over in her palm, and something stirred. Not a sharp memory, more like a scent before a picture. Pine, wind moving through branches, a voice calling from a porch. The place, a refuge. A place no one had ever asked about. A place the outside world had never touched. Her grip tightened around the key, and for the first time since the car disappeared, Margaret raised her head. Not toward the road Daniel had taken, toward somewhere else entirely. The next morning, she sat in the back of an intercity bus, both suitcases wedged upright against her knees, her handbag balanced on her lap. Through the glass, the city fell away, smeared into pale grey streaks and low rooflines dissolving in early mist. The driver kept quiet, so did every other passenger. Each one carried their own destination, their own reason for leaving whatever they'd left behind. And not a single soul glanced at the older woman sitting perfectly still, hands folded, her thumb tracing the shape of a key hidden inside her coat pocket. 2 buses and a short walk from the last stop, and the pavement ended. Just stopped, like a sentence cut short. Ahead stretched a narrow dirt path, crowded on both sides by thick trees, wild grass spilling over the edges. No one had walked this trail in a long time. Margaret gripped her suitcase handle and kept moving. The small wheels caught on loose stones, on roots forcing their way up through packed earth. She had to stop more than once, to shift her grip on the handle, to pull air into her lungs, to look back down the road that seemed to stretch longer with every step she took. The air out here was something else entirely. Damp earth, pine resin, rotting leaves, and that peculiar dry cold that only deep woods carry in late autumn. Traffic noise had dissolved somewhere behind her, replaced by branches whispering against each other far overhead and the soft crush of dry leaves beneath her shoes. Margaret questioned the path more than once. 40 years can reshape a landscape beyond recognition. Memory softens edges, warms colors, lies gently. But when she rounded the third bend, where the tree line opened into clearing, there it was, the cabin. Smaller than she remembered, leaning slightly to the left, but standing. The wooden roof had darkened under decades of rain and sun. One corner of the porch drooped badly. The old railing wore a skin of dust and moss. Yet the structure held. It sat there with a stillness so complete it seemed as though it had never been abandoned at all. Margaret stopped a few paces from the porch. She did not climb the steps. She just stood, looking, making sure this was real, not some phantom conjured by exhaustion and despair. The thin curtain still hung in the left window. The wooden chair where Rose Bennett had spent so many slow afternoons still leaned against the wall, one leg slightly crooked. A cracked ceramic pot rested beneath the eaves, empty for years, clearly. She dragged a suitcase onto the first step. The old wood groaned. Second step. Third. The original door waited, its brass lock gone dark with tarnish. Margaret drew the key from her coat pocket, studied it, slid it into the lock. It resisted. She pressed harder, working it deeper into the tumblers. A dry click. The bolt gave. The door swung inward, slow, loud, groaning on its hinges. Inside was dimmer than she expected. Not true darkness. A muted half-light strained through filthy glass. Cool air, heavy, carrying the smell of wood that had been aging in silence for decades. Margaret set her bags just past the threshold and stood still, let her eyes catch up. Then she stepped inside. Everything was almost exactly where it had always been. The wooden table in the centre, draped in white cloth gone yellow with time. The small gathering of chairs near the hearth. The low bookshelf against the wall, still holding empty glass jars and a few cloth-bound books. The grey stone fireplace with a tidy stack of firewood beside it, as if someone had meant to light a fire one particular evening and never returned. She moved through the living space slowly, fingertips grazing the tabletop, the chair backs, the rough lip of the fireplace. In the small kitchen beyond, the hanging pot rack, the porcelain sink, the wooden cabinet with its slightly warped door. She opened every drawer. Porcelain plates, tablecloths folded with care, a box of matches gone soft with dampness, a bottle of oil tucked into the lowest shelf. Nothing that Daniel would have called valuable. No precious metals, no financial documents, no showy possessions. Only things kept by someone who believed objects existed to serve life, not to be displayed for admiration. At the end of the narrow hallway lay the small bedroom, the bedspread still in place, colours faded but clean beneath a veil of dust. A patchwork quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. On the wall hung the embroidered wildflower frame, stitched by her mother during her last winter. And in the corner, beside the base of the wardrobe, stood the wooden trunk. Margaret lowered herself carefully, pressing her palm against the trunk's lid. The hinges resisted, stiff, reluctant, but gave way. What lay inside was nothing she'd expected. No old clothes, no forgotten letters. Notebooks, dozens of them, stacked in neat rows, their cloth covers worn to shades of brown, blue and grey. Each spine marked in her mother's unmistakable hand. Summer gardening, preserving herbs, miscellaneous kitchen notes. Margaret lifted the one on top, sat on the bed's edge, and opened to the first page. The penmanship was steady.
__quote _20 __.
She turned several more pages. How to dehydrate apples. A technique for keeping mint fragrant through winter. When to plant beans. Waiting until the soil held just enough warmth. Between the instructions, small observations appeared. The weather on a given day. The exact color of the sky. A quiet note that nothing of real value should ever be thrown away. Margaret set the notebook in her lap, looked toward the open window, then rose and walked back to the main room. She lit the fire as dusk settled in, boiled water in the old kettle, found clean blankets folded in the upper cupboard, opened the smaller suitcase for a change of clothes and a few necessities. When the flames steadied, she pulled a chair to the hearth, placed the notebook on the table beside her, and took in the room one last time. Outside, the wind had changed course, threading through the trees, tapping softly against the wooden roof. The first morning came with the sound of timber contracting in cold air and thin light creeping past the curtain's edge. Margaret woke in the narrow bed. It took a moment to place herself. Low ceiling, dark planks, the smell of wood smoke still clinging to everything. Beyond the walls, the forest stood motionless under a fine layer of mist. She sat up, pulled on her cardigan, stepped into her worn shoes and moved into the main room. Beneath the ash, the embers still glowed faintly. She stirred them with the iron poker, added small logs, waited for flame, set the kettle on the stove. In daylight, the cabin showed itself more honestly. The ware was plain to see, but so was something else. A quiet stubbornness in the bones of the place, a willingness to be useful again, if someone would meet it halfway. Margaret opened every window, wedged the front door open with a wooden block, and began to clean. She pulled the dust covers from table and chairs, hauled them outside, shook the grime loose, found a broom and swept every corner of the place. Dry leaves, cobwebs, the narrow hallways accumulated silence. When she stayed bent too long, her back announced itself, a dull, familiar ache. When she straightened too fast, her knees locked. She didn't rush, she simply didn't stop. By midday, the floorboards showed lighter wood beneath where dust had been. Sunlight poured through the front window, throwing a long, bright rectangle across the table. She scrubbed the kitchen sink, reorganized the dishes, wiped every glass jar one by one. The tall cabinet beside the fireplace held a small cloth bag of dried beans, far too old for planting, but still whole. Beneath it, several white candles, a coil of thin rope, a bottle of oil nearly full. In the afternoon, she carried one of Rose Bennett's notebooks outside and lowered herself onto the porch steps. A light breeze moved through the small yard. The earliest entries were plain. Sweep the chimney before winter sets in. Store dry firewood under the porch roof. But as she read deeper, page after page, something became clear. These notebooks had not been written carelessly. Every line carried the quiet precision of someone who believed that what she knew mattered, even if no one else was watching. They held something far deeper than recipes or household tips, a whole way of seeing the world, set down in handwriting so clear and steady it seemed to breathe with purpose. When making strawberry jam, don't rush your thinking about the sugar. First, look at the strawberries. The ones gone soft, use them now. The ones still firm, save them for the next round. The kitchen is like life. Not everything belongs in the same moment. The next page laid out a method for soaking apples with cinnamon. After that, instructions for drying rosemary leaves without losing their scent. One section described how to set up a small stand by the road when spring arrived, when people passing through would start craving something homemade instead of whatever the town shops stocked in plastic. Margaret let her gaze rest on that passage longer than the others. That evening, she made a simple dinner from what remained in her suitcase and a few items picked up at a rest stop the day before. Then she sat by the fire and kept reading, one notebook to the next. An entire volume devoted to sourdough bread, plum jam, elderberry syrup. Another catalogued the leaves growing in the forest nearby. Which ones eased a cough? Which ones drove away insects? Which ones were dangerous unless dried long and thoroughly in full sun? Inside the back cover of a grey notebook, tucked against the cardboard, Rose Bennett had folded a single sheet of paper. names of people who once lived in the area, what they bought and in which season. The 3 days that followed settled into a quiet pattern. Mornings. She lit the fire, cleaned, fixed what needed fixing. Midday. She read the notebooks, memorized what she could, reorganized the kitchen shelf by shelf. Afternoons. She walked the land around the cabin. She found the ghost of a vegetable garden buried under grass. A few wild sage bushes still holding on beside a rotting fence. A low apple tree, trunk twisted and knotted, but alive, strong. Under a mound of dead leaves in the small shed along the side wall, Margaret pulled out a hoe, a shovel, a rake. Rust dusted their blades like age spots on old hands. She wiped them down with a damp cloth, set them back against the wall. As winter pressed harder, the cabin stopped looking abandoned. On the windowsill, a pitcher of clean water. On the kitchen table, bread she had baked herself, following her mother's recipe. The first loaf came out too dense, but it was bread, real bread, made by her hands. On the shelf beside the fireplace, 3 jars stood in a neat row, washed, dried, turned upside down. Margaret began writing in a fresh notebook pulled from the bottom of the trunk, filling its blank back pages. The date, the weather, what she had done that day, what she needed to buy whenever she could make it into town. By the close of her 2nd month, she walked into town carrying a paper bag of small baked pastries and 1 jar of apple cinnamon jam, made step by careful step from the notebook's instructions. Nobody knew her face. The man running the general store watched her a beat too long when she asked for sugar pectin, a set of jar lids, and a packet of cheap seeds. But the woman behind the counter at the kitchen supply shop, she tasted a spoonful of the jam, looked up, asked if Margaret made more. Margaret said she was only experimenting. The woman smiled. Said next time she came through, she should bring a bigger batch. 1 week later, Margaret dragged an old wooden crate to the edge of the dirt road, maybe 20 steps from the cabin. On it, she arranged 3 jars of jam, 2 small loaves of bread, a bundle of sage tied with string, and a hand-printed sign in black ink. Homemade goods, place money in the tin box. She didn't stand beside it. She sat on the porch with a notebook in her lap, glancing across the yard now and then. The first car eased to a stop just before noon. A man in a heavy coat stepped out, lifted a jar of jam, turned it in his hands, glanced toward the cabin. He left money in the box. By midday, a couple came through, bought bread and the bundle of herbs. They wanted to know who made them. Margaret answered from the porch. She did. The woman smiled, said they'd come back if their route brought them this way, on the right day. When the light softened toward evening, Margaret carried the tin box inside. A few folded bills, some coins. She set it on the table, opened the new notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote the first entry under the heading, Early Spring, Prepare Ahead. 1 by 1 she recorded what had sold, then traced the total with the tip of her pen. Not much, but enough to go back into town for sugar, flour, jar lids, a handful of cheap seed packets. After that day, the wooden crate by the road stopped being an experiment. She scrubbed the table's surface, cleaned the worn edges of the wood, wedged 2 flat stones beneath the legs so it stood firm on the ground. On the handwritten sign, she added 1 careful line beneath the words __, quote, _24, __. In the weeks that followed, more people came. Some bought a single jar of preserves and left. Others lingered, asking directions to town, wondering whether the dried bundle was rosemary or sage, asking if she planned to bake apple bread the following week. Margaret answered briefly, gave little of herself away, asked nothing in return. But slowly certain faces became familiar. A man in an old pickup stopped most Friday mornings for 2 loaves. A nurse from a clinic 10 miles out came regularly for plum jam and herbal infusions. An elderly couple from a nearby community brought her small containers of seedlings. The soil around the cabin, they said, caught enough sun for beans and mint. Margaret took them, carried them behind the cabin, opened her mother's journal again, marked each planting spot in the dirt with short wooden stakes. Winter loosened its grip slowly, giving way to the damp cool of early spring. Green appeared around the cabin, tangled with weeds at first, then separating itself as she turned each section of soil. Mustard greens, scallions, climbing beans, thyme, marigolds to keep the insects back, a row of mint along the fence. On the front porch, she hung herb bundles to dry, stems facing down, and beneath them the wooden table stood with a fresh cloth. Jars lined up straighter than before, the handwritten labels neater now. Each week the selection grew by a jar, a bundle, a small addition. The cabin itself seemed to match this rhythm. The leaning porch rail, propped at first with a scrap of lumber from the shed, was later secured properly, the truck driver lending a hand one afternoon. The kitchen window frame got sealed, where drafts had crept through. A new shelf went up near the hearth for finished jars. On the wall across from the front door, Margaret hung a small slate with the week's tasks. 3 more batches of strawberry preserves. Dry apples. Fix the back curtain. Check the porch roof before the heavy rain comes. Everything finding its order. At first light, she would start the fire, shape the dough, and wait for the yeast to rise. By midday, she was in the garden, pulling dead leaves, clearing weeds, watching new shoots push through dark soil. Afternoons belonged to the kitchen, jam bubbling low on the stove, jars scrubbed clean, lids pressed tight, dates written careful on every label. Evenings drew her back to the ancestral journals, where she'd try a forgotten recipe or copy passages into her own notebook with steady hands. Those pages grew thick over time, but what filled them now wasn't Rose Bennett's voice anymore. It was Margaret Hale's, her own thoughts, her own knowing. Once the nurse asked how long she'd been living there. Less than a year, Margaret told her. The woman looked around, at the garden, the small display of goods for sale, the porch roof patched clean and straight, and said the place looked like someone had been caring for it a long time. Margaret smoothed the cloth along the table's edge, said there was still plenty left to do. Word about the little house on the unpaved road spread the way useful things always spread in tight communities. Not loudly, not ahead of time. Just one person telling another that you could get exceptional apple bread there, that the preserves weren't too sweet, that dried herb bundles hung from the rafters for steeping, good for sore throats, that the woman living alone out near the woods understood soil, understood which plants would grow where others gave up. A few people started taking the longer route just to stop by. A restaurant owner asked if she could produce 20 jars of blueberry preserves by next month. The young woman setting up a weekend produce stall wanted to know if Margaret would bring goods into town. Margaret didn't say yes to everything. She measured what her hands could hold, counted the empty jars, walked the vegetable beds behind the house, weighed each request against the fragile balance of this life she'd only just built. Then she agreed to some, not all. Each time a new task appeared, she opened her mother's journal, searching those faded notes for some method of organizing it, as though Rose Bennett still stood somewhere in that narrow kitchen, quietly reminding her that anything made by hand must never outgrow the hands that make it. By early summer, climbing beans had swallowed an entire section of fence. The mint spread so aggressively she had to split it between 2 old clay pots. The apple tree behind the cabin gave a small yield, but the fruit held firm, enough for several batches of pastry. On the front porch, 4 mismatched chairs lined the wall for anyone who wanted to sit and drink tea. A tin can couldn't hold the loose change anymore. She replaced it with a wooden box that had a sliding lid. Her mother's journals stood in neat stacks on the kitchen shelf, each bundle marked with ribbons cut from salvaged fabric. Her own notebook had nearly doubled in thickness since the first entry. On an afternoon near the end of August, Margaret was setting jars of apple and cinnamon preserve on the outdoor table when she heard an engine. Coming from the far end of the dirt track. It didn't sound like the delivery vans, didn't rumble like the local pickup trucks. This was smoother, quieter, more enclosed. She looked up. A dark sedan rounded the bend, moving slow, and stopped at the clearing's edge before the cabin. The driver's door opened. Daniel Hale stepped out. He stood beside the car without moving. His eyes traveled across the garden, up to the mended porch roof, over the wooden table heavy with goods, past the cabin door left halfway open, and came to rest on Margaret. She set the last jar on the table, smoothed the tablecloth, and only then let herself stand straight. Daniel shut the car door and walked a few paces forward, stopping at the edge of the clearing, like a man unsure whether the ground ahead still belonged to him. Dark overcoat, polished shoes, shirt collar pressed to a razor crease. Everything about him looked the same as it always had. Everything except the way he moved. His stride had lost its old sharpness. The skin around his eyes had started to sag, pulling features once carved from authority into something softer, something tired. Quote 25, he said. She looked at him, did not nod, did not wave him closer. She stood beside the wooden table with her hands resting on the edge of the cloth, still as the trees behind her. Quote 26 __. His eyes moved across the garden again, the bundles of herbs drying beneath the porch roof, the neat rows of glass jars, pots of mint flanking the steps. His gaze lingered on the straightened porch railing, the shed door cracked open, the handwritten sign near the entrance. The more he saw, the slower his words came. Quote 27, quote, he said quietly. Quote 28, quote. The words landed without force, no edge, no volume, and precisely because of that, they hung in the air longer. He lifted his hand, brushed his cuff. The old reflex. Automatic. But this time, the gesture carried no weight behind it, quote, he admitted. Wind crossed the yard. The corner of the wooden sign rocked gently. Daniel dropped his eyes to the ground, then raised them again. He corrected himself fast, as though catching the implication before it fully landed. Daniel breathed in slowly. His gaze drifted to the car parked beyond the clearing. Margaret didn't ask how. She walked to the far end of the table, slid the wooden coin box deeper into the shade, and came back to face him. "Why are you here?" Daniel said nothing for a moment. For the first time since stepping out of his car, he stopped scanning the property and looked straight at her. "To talk." "We've talked?" "No." "We discussed paperwork, court filings, arrangements that needed handling." The pause. That wasn't talking. Margaret bent and picked a dry leaf the wind had left on the table. "When you stood outside that house and told me I could be placed in a facility, I thought you'd said everything there was to say." His jaw tightened, barely visible, but there. Things were completely different then. Different how? Daniel moved one step closer, then caught himself before his foot reached the porch stairs. "The family house," he said, eyes drifting for a second. It didn't last long. Costs ran higher than I'd planned. Property taxes, repairs. Then the real estate agent didn't follow through on his promises. I had to sell. Margaret's expression didn't shift. She straightened a paper label on the nearest jar of preserves. The new apartment didn't work out either. Everything changed fast. Did it? He watched her for several more seconds, waiting for something bigger than two flat words. Nothing came. He pressed on. "I didn't drive out here to talk about money, but you brought it up first." Daniel let the air out of his lungs slowly. "Fine. I'll say it plainly. I heard about you. Someone in town mentioned the old woman living out in the woods who bakes bread, puts up preserves, sells herbs. They talked about this place like it was somewhere everyone ought to visit at least once. He looked around again, slower this time, more careful. I didn't expect you to build all of this. I didn't build everything, only what mattered. That's still a lot, not by your old way of measuring things. I was wrong. I figured once it was all done, you'd move somewhere near the city, maybe stay with family. Or... The sentence hung there, unfinished. I couldn't picture this. That's the only true thing you've said since you stepped out of your car. Margaret, I didn't come here to fight. But you didn't come just to look at the garden either. I want to know if there's a way to fix some of this. She lifted her chin and looked him straight in the eyes. Which part? I don't know. A real conversation, a different arrangement. Maybe we handled the whole thing too coldly. You handled it. I just stood on the other side of the table. You understand what I mean? No, I don't understand you at all anymore. The wind shifted. The smell of ripe apples drifted from behind the cabin. Daniel pulled off his gloves and held them in one fist. The unease was plain now, that old composure no longer hiding it. I thought I was handling everything the right way, he said. Assets, legal matters, obligations. I thought that was the proper thing to do. Proper for whom? He had no answer. Margaret moved along the table's edge closer to the porch steps, but she didn't go down into the yard. The gap between them shrank just enough that neither had to raise their voice. You took the house, she said. You took the bank account. You took the car. You took everything that could carry your name on paper. Daniel's head dipped. I know. Did you think that was the end of it? He looked up. His eyes were heavier now. At the time, maybe I did. Margaret reached over and touched the cabin's door frame beside her. Her fingertips rested briefly on an old scratch in the wood. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Margaret didn't look away. You took the things that belonged to the life I used to live. But this place was never yours. Nothing in it is. Daniel looked around once more, slower this time, different, as though for the first time he wasn't just startled, he was trying to understand. The porch was simple in its repair. The rows of plants behind it weren't magazine perfect. The chairs under the roof didn't match. Everything here was plain, functional, built for use, not for show. And that was exactly why none of it felt temporary. Is this what your mother left you? He asked. Yes. I think I remember her mentioning a place somewhere. His gaze dropped to the ground. I never listened. Margaret's reply came fast. Maybe I never listened to as many things as I thought I did either. She didn't correct him. She offered no comfort. She didn't argue. She stood there, quiet as stone, leaving space for whatever else he might force into the open. I thought life was built from what you could put on paper, Daniel said. The house, the accounts, the contracts, everything labelled and under control. I figured if we split it all down the middle, that would be the cleanest way through. You always liked things neat. A ghost of a smile crossed his face and died. But nothing was as clean as I told myself. You didn't drive out here to share your philosophy on living. No, he admitted. I came because I wanted to know if there was anything left between us worth holding on to. She let the silence sit. A leaf broke loose from the branch overhead, spiraling down to the table's edge, landing between two jars of apple preserves. Margaret picked it up, tucked it into the clay pot beside them. Holding on to, she said. And where exactly do you think that lives? Maybe in the fact that we spent most of our lives together, Daniel offered. Maybe in the fact that I didn't understand what was happening until it was already done. It is already done. I expected you'd say that. Not because I want to make this harder for you, Margaret said. Because it's the truth. I heard people talk about you. Quote 102. At first, I didn't believe it. Then I figured they were exaggerating. But driving in here, he shook his head barely. I see why they talk about this place. Do you? They're not pitying you. They talk like you've built something that matters. A place people want to stop at. A place they carry with them after they leave. Margaret didn't answer right away. Wind moved through the bundles of herbs hanging beneath the porch roof. They swayed against each other, whispering. Do you understand what that means? She asked. Daniel looked at her. I'm not sure I do. It means that for the first time in years, people come to me because of what I make, not because of the position I held inside someone else's house. He took those words without flinching. I didn't see that. You never looked. I thought I walked out of that marriage with everything that mattered.
But I was wrong.
I see it now. You took what was easy to see, but you walked away from what was never yours to take. Yes, you should go. Take good care of yourself, Margaret. You too, Daniel. She stepped back inside, closed the door softly. The wood swallowed the yard inch by inch. The car parked along the dirt road, the man standing alone in a place that was never his. The latch clicked shut. Margaret moved past the wooden table, past the row of glass jars catching the last ember light. She crossed to the window that faced the garden behind the cabin. Outside, the fruit trees held perfectly still in the dying glow. On the kitchen ledge, her notebook waited, open to the page with the next recipe, apple and cinnamon preserves. She picked up her pen, drew out the chair, sat down, and picked up the unfinished line right where she'd left it. The pen traveled steady across the paper. Every word arriving slow and clear. The way everything here had been built, not rushed, not showy, but strong enough to last. Beyond the window, the final light pulled itself below the treetops. The dirt road settled back into its silence. No engine sound, no trace of what had passed through. As if nothing had happened at all. What remained was the cabin, the garden, and a life moving forward at its own rhythm, owing proof to no one. If you've walked alongside this story to its final steps, thank you for giving your time to a journey that carried no explosions, but held enough weight to reshape a life from the inside out. If you'd like to find more stories built this way, stories of loss, of hands that rebuild, of the quiet things sturdy enough to hold an entire existence together, leave a like, share it forward, or simply stay. And if one truth survives this telling, let it be this. What mattered most was never something anyone else had the power to take.